Welcome to Lore of the Ring, where we uncover the hidden roads of Middle-earth and tell the tales that Tolkien never wrote. Before we begin, take a moment to let us know in the comments where you're watching from and what time of day or night this narration has reached you. In the deep places of the world where stone remembers and shadow listens, there exist artifacts whose names have faded from memory, yet whose influence ripples still through the currents of time. We speak of rings, not merely the one ring whose tale has been told in fire and song, but of others. The forgotten, the forsaken, the feared. Long ago, when the mountains of Middle-earth still gleamed with the light of their making, and rivers ran clear as starlight through virgin forests, the Second Age dawned. Morgoth, the first Dark Lord, had been cast beyond the circles of the world. His iron crown lay broken. His towers of malice crumbled into dust. For a breath of eternity, it seemed that peace might endure. The elves sang beneath canopies of malorn and oak. Men built their kingdoms upon foundations of hope. Dwarves delved deep, their hammers ringing in celebration rather than war. But peace is a fragile thing, a glass sculpture balanced upon the edge of a blade. Into this world of tentative light, a shadow began to creep, subtle, patient, wearing the mask of friendship. Sauron, greatest of Morgoth's servants, had survived the ruin of his master. He walked among the peoples of Middle-earth not as a tyrant, but as a counselor, a teacher, a bearer of gifts. His voice was honey. His wisdom seemed boundless, and in the hidden fires of his forge, he prepared the instruments of dominion, the rings of power. Even the name carries weight, a gravity that bends the air around it. 19 rings for mortal lords, 3 for elvish kings, and one, the one to bind them all. This much is known. This much has been sung by bards and recorded in the annals of lore. But what of the others? What of the rings whose names were never inscribed in the Red Book, whose bearers left no chronicles, whose very existence was whispered only in the secret councils of the wise before being sealed away behind veils of silence? The great tales speak of the one, of Isildur's bane and Frodo's burden. They speak of the 3, Vilya, Narya, and Nenya, preserved in the hands of Elrond, Gandalf, and Galadriel. They recount the doom of the 9, who became wraiths, and the 7, which kindled greed in the hearts of dwarf lords. Yet between these lines of history, in the margins where ink fades and parchment crumbles, other truths wait. There were rings whose purposes remained shrouded. Rings of lesser power, perhaps, but not lesser consequence. Rings that shaped the fates of forgotten kingdoms, that whispered in the dreams of nameless lords, that lay hidden in vaults beneath mountains that no longer have names. Tonight, we descend into those forgotten depths. We trace the threads of lore that Tolkien himself left tantalizingly incomplete, fragments in appendices, hints in letters, shadows in unfinished tales. We seek the rings that history overlooked, and in seeking them, we may discover why they were meant to be forgotten. For some secrets, once spoken aloud, cannot be unspoken. Some doors once opened cannot be closed. And some rings, once remembered, may remember you in turn. The tale begins not with darkness, but with light, fragile, beautiful, and doomed. To speak of the forgotten rings, we must first anchor ourselves in what is known, in the texts that survived the breaking of the world and the fading of the elves. We turn to the archives, not merely stories, but fragments of a mythology so vast that even its creator could not fully contain it. John Ronald Reuel Tolkien was more than a storyteller. He was a philologist, a scholar of languages dead and living, a man who understood that true mythology is never complete. It is layered, contradictory, filled with gaps where oral tradition faltered or manuscripts burned. In creating Middle-earth, he crafted not just a world but an archaeology of that world. Texts within texts, chronicles that reference older chronicles, songs that preserve what annals have lost. In The Lord of the Rings, we are told of 20 rings of power. The verse is famous, carved into the One Ring itself in the Black Speech of Mordor. 3 rings for the Elven kings under the sky. 7 for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. 9 for mortal men doomed to die. 1 for the Dark Lord on his dark throne. 20 rings. This is the official count, the number repeated in appendices and affirmed in the Silmarillion. Yet Tolkien's writings are filled with ambiguities, with mentions of lesser rings and essays in the craft before Sauron made the one. In his letters, he speaks of rings made for practice, for experimentation, rings that possessed power but were not part of the Great Count. Unfinished Tales and the History of Middle-earth volumes compiled by Christopher Tolkien reveal even more. Drafts where the number of rings fluctuates, where their purposes shift, where entire storylines are abandoned like ruins half buried by sand. In these fragments, we glimpse a larger pattern. The rings of power were not merely 19 artifacts plus one master ring. They were part of a broader sorcery, a web of enchantment that touched more lives and more lands than the famous tales recount. We know that Celebrimbor, greatest of the elven smiths of Eregion, forged the rings under Sauron's tutelage, though Sauron, disguised as the fair Anatar, concealed his true nature. We know that the technique involved binding a portion of the maker's power into the metal itself, a process akin to tearing off pieces of one's soul and imprisoning them in gold and mithril. This was not mere craft. This was metaphysical surgery, dangerous and irreversible. But the texts also mention that not all rings were equal. Some were mightier than others. Some were made before Sauron revealed himself and forged the one. Some may have been made in secret, by those who learned the art but used it for purposes unknown. Even Tolkien himself seemed uncertain of the full extent of the ring's influence. In one letter, he writes that the number 379 was symbolic, rooted in numerology and myth-making, but that the actual history might have been more complex. In another, he suggests that there could have been other rings, failures or prototypes, which still carried a measure of perilous enchantment. This is the foundation upon which we build our inquiry. Tolkien's own admission that the lore is incomplete, that the histories recorded by elves and men are themselves imperfect, that in the deep places, in the ruins and the shadows, there may be artifacts whose stories were deliberately erased, either because they were too dangerous to remember, or because their bearers never lived to tell them. We are archaeologists sifting through myth, seeking the shape of truth beneath layers of legend. And what we have found suggests that the tale of the rings of power is far stranger and far darker than the songs admit. For if 20 rings could reshape the destiny of the world, what might a 21st do? Or a 22nd? What if the count itself is a lie, a simplification meant to comfort those who need their histories neat and their villains clear? The answer lies in the fragments, in the gaps between the words, in the silences that echo louder than song. Let us begin with the 7, for their tale is perhaps the most tragic and the most misunderstood. 7 rings for the dwarf lords in their halls of stone. The verse speaks of them as if they were uniform, identical instruments of Sauron's will distributed evenly among the fathers of the 7 dwarf clans. But the reality, as always, is more complex. The dwarves were not like men or elves. They were creatures of stone and fire, wrought by Alla the smith in the deeps of time before the awakening of the elves. They were made to endure, stubborn, proud, resistant to domination. When Sauron distributed the 7 rings, he believed he was planting seeds of control, invisible chains that would bind the dwarf lords to his will as surely as the 9 would bind the kings of men. He was wrong. Picture, if you will, the Hall of Durin in Khazad-dûm before the shadow came. Columns of living stone rise into darkness, carved with the genealogies of kings and the histories of battles won and mountains claimed. The air hums with the distant rhythm of hammers, the heartbeat of the mountain itself. In the center of this hall, on a throne carved from a single block of obsidian, sits the dwarf lord. Upon his finger gleams a ring, gold, set with a gem that seems to burn with its own inner light. The ring whispers. It promises. It shows visions of veins of mithril deeper than any yet discovered, of hoards that would make even dragons weep with envy. It magnifies the dwarf lord's natural love of craft and treasure, transforming it into an obsession, a hunger that can never be satisfied. The lord begins to delve deeper. His miners follow shafts that plunge into the roots of the world. The wealth of the kingdom swells beyond measure, but so does the greed, the suspicion, the hoarding instinct that turns generosity to miserliness and caution to paranoia. Yet the ring cannot dominate. It cannot turn the dwarf lord into a slave. The dwarves were not made by Eru to be ruled, and the rings, for all their power, could not override the fundamental nature of their bearers. Sauron fumed in Barad-dûr. The dwarves enriched themselves but did not bow. They hoarded wealth but did not submit. They became, at worst, difficult allies, never servants. But the rings were not without effect. Of the 7, some were consumed by dragon fire when the great worms descended upon dwarf kingdoms in greed. The ring of Thrain, father of Thorin Oakenshield, was taken from him in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, where Sauron himself had returned in secret. One by one, the 7 were lost, reclaimed by Sauron or destroyed by Dragonflame. Or so the histories claim. But consider, the dwarves are secretive. Their halls run deeper than any elf or man has ever mapped. Their treasuries are sealed behind doors that no thief has breached. If a dwarf lord wished to hide a ring, to remove it from the count, to bury it in a vault 1,000 fathoms below the surface, who would know? Who would dare to ask? There are whispers, fragmentary accounts, half-remembered tales from the Blue Mountains and the Iron Hills of rings that were never accounted for. Rings that a desperate king might have hidden rather than let fall into Sauron's hands. Rings whose influence still lingers in the deep places, amplifying the greed of those who delve too eagerly, whispering promises of mithril and gold to miners who follow the veins too far and never return. In the Fourth Age, after the fall of Sauron, some dwarf holds reported strange findings. Bands of metal, ancient and powerful, discovered in collapsed tunnels or buried beneath rockfalls. Were these remnants of the 7? Or were they something else? Lesser rings, perhaps, made by dwarf smiths who had learned the art from the rings they bore, attempting to replicate the power without the taint. The dwarves do not speak of such things to outsiders. They keep their secrets as they keep their gold, locked away, hidden from the light, treasured and feared in equal measure. We know that the rings amplified the dwarves' natural traits. We know they could not dominate but could corrupt. But what we do not know, what the songs do not tell, is whether all the 7 are truly gone. In the darkness beneath the mountains, In halls that have not seen daylight since the world was young, rings may yet lie waiting. And if a dwarf were to find one, to slip it onto his finger in the greed madness that the deep places inspire, would he recognize the danger before it was too late? Or would he simply dig deeper, following the whispers, until the mountain itself swallowed him whole? The 7 were meant to control. They failed. But in failing, they became something perhaps more dangerous, unsupervised, unbound, forgotten. A ring that no Dark Lord claims is a ring that answers to no one, and in that freedom lies a different kind of peril. Now we turn to the 9, and here the tale grows darker still, for the 9 succeeded where the 7 failed. They did not merely corrupt. They annihilated. 9 rings for mortal men doomed to die. The phrase itself is a prophecy and a doom. Men, unlike dwarves or elves, are mortal. They hunger for life even as it slips through their fingers. They fear death, envy the immortal, grasp at power as a shield against the inevitable. It is this fear, this grasping, that made them perfect vessels for Sauron's purpose. The 9 were not given to peasants or warriors. They were given to kings, great lords, sorcerers, men of power and ambition who already commanded armies and held dominion over vast lands. They were men who believed themselves exceptional, who thought they could master the rings rather than be mastered by them. They were wrong. Imagine the first moment. A ring placed in a velvet-lined box, presented by an emissary who speaks of alliance and friendship. The king takes it, feels the weight of the gold, slides it onto his finger. For a moment, there is only beauty. The craftsmanship is exquisite, the gem flawless. And then the power awakens. At first, it seems like a gift. The king's vision sharpens. He can see farther, hear whispers from distant rooms, sense the thoughts and fears of those around him. His enemies fall before him as if their strategies were written in his mind. His kingdom expands. His wealth multiplies. He is becoming more than mortal, stronger, longer-lived, untouched by disease or the weakness of age. But the ring is hungry. It feeds on him even as it empowers him. His appearance begins to change, not all at once, but gradually, imperceptibly. His skin grows pale, stretched thin over bone. His eyes sink into shadow. He feels the pull of the ring constantly, a tether that draws tighter with each passing year. He stops eating, though he does not starve. He stops sleeping, though he does not rest. He fades. The process takes decades, perhaps centuries, but the end is inevitable. One day, the king looks into a mirror and sees not a man but a shadow, a wraith thing that exists halfway between the worlds of the living and the dead. He has become a Nazgul, a ring wraith, a servant of Sauron bound to the one ring as iron is bound to a lodestone. The 9 rings did not merely corrupt their bearers. They consumed them, hollowed them out, and filled the empty shells with Sauron's will. The kings who once ruled in their own names became extensions of the Dark Lord, his eyes and hands in the world. They could not die, not truly, for they were already dead. They could not escape, for the rings had become part of their essence, fused to their spectral forms as surely as flesh to bone. We know the names of some. The Witch King of Angmar, greatest and most terrible of the 9, who broke the kingdom of Arnor and whose blade carried a curse that no mortal healing could undo. Khamul, the Shadow of the East, who served Sauron in the lands beyond Mordor. The others remain nameless, their identities erased by the centuries of servitude, their kingdoms forgotten, their monuments crumbled to dust. But what of the rings themselves? Unlike the 7, the 9 were never lost or reclaimed by Sauron, at least, not according to the lore. The Nazgul continued to bear them, invisible on their spectral fingers until the end. When the One Ring was destroyed and Sauron's power collapsed, the 9 ringwraiths were unmade, their forms dissolving like smoke before the wind. Yet did the rings themselves perish. Physical objects, even those imbued with great sorcery, do not simply vanish when their master falls. The One Ring survived in the fires of Mount Doom for 3,000 years before Frodo cast it back into the flames. The 3 rings lost their power when the one was destroyed, but they did not cease to exist. They simply became inert, fading relics of a bygone age. What then of the 9? If they survived the unmaking of the Nazgul, where would they have fallen? In the ruins of Minas Morgul, where the Witch King dwelt. In the ashen wastes of Mordor. In forgotten battlefields where the ringwraiths rode and died and rode again. The thought is chilling. 9 rings, still laden with the enchantments that turned kings into wraiths, lying somewhere in the world. Inert, perhaps, but not destroyed. And if someone were to find one, to study it, to foolishly place it upon their finger hoping to claim its power, would the ring awaken? Would it remember its purpose, its hunger? Would it begin the slow, inexorable process of transformation once more, even without Sauron to guide it? There are no answers in the texts. Tolkien himself left this question unresolved. We know the Nazgul were destroyed. We do not know the fate of their rings. And in that silence, a terror lingers. The possibility that the instruments of the most complete domination Sauron ever achieved still exist, waiting in shadow for a hand to claim them. For the 9 were not merely tools. They were masterpieces of dark sorcery, the perfection of Sauron's art. If they survived, they remain among the most dangerous artifacts ever forged. Not for their power alone, but for what they represent. The utter annihilation of self, the transformation of king into slave, of man into shadow. And shadows once cast are not easily dispelled. Beyond the great rings, the 3, the 7, and the 9, there exists a penumbra of lesser artifacts, rings mentioned in passing or implied by silence. These are the forgotten ones, the essays in craft, the failures and experiments that preceded the great works. Tolkien writes of them sparingly, a sentence here, a footnote there. In one account, he mentions that Sauron made many rings before he forged the one, testing his art, refining his technique. Some of these he gave as gifts to cultivate alliances. Others he kept, using them to extend his perception and influence. But not all were accounted for. Not all were catalogued. What became of these lesser rings? Picture a workshop in a region, in the years before the forging of the One Ring. Celebrimbor and his smiths labor at their anvils, working gold and mithril and gems brought from the depths of the earth. Sauron, in his fair disguise as Anadar, moves among them, offering suggestions, guiding their hands. Together they create rings, dozens, perhaps hundreds, each a wonder of craftsmanship, each imbued with a measure of power. Some preserve beauty, keeping the wearer fair and untouched by time. Some sharpen the mind or quicken the reflexes. Some grant foresight or protection from fire or the ability to command beasts. These are not the great rings of power, but they are potent nonetheless. Treasures that any lord would covet, tools that could change the course of a life or a kingdom. But they are also dangerous. Any ring made with Sauron's art carries a seed of his malice, a subtle taint that grows stronger the longer it is worn. The enchantments may seem benign. Who would not wish to remain fair, to think clearly, to be protected from harm? But they create dependence. The wearer begins to need the ring, to feel incomplete without it. And in that need, Sauron finds his opening. When Celebrimbor discovered Sauron's treachery and the elves went to war, These lesser rings were scattered. Some were hidden, buried in secret vaults or cast into rivers. Some were claimed by men or dwarves who did not understand their nature. Some were lost in the chaos of battle, trampled into mud or swallowed by the earth. We know that at least some survived into the Third Age. In The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf speaks of lesser rings that the enemy made, trinkets compared to the great rings but still perilous. He warns that even these can ensnare the unwary, binding them to habits of secrecy and covetousness. But how many existed? Where are they now? And what distinguishes a lesser ring from one of the great ones? The answer may lie not in raw power but in purpose. The great rings, the 3, the 7, the 9, were designed to control, to dominate specific peoples. The lesser rings were more general, their enchantments less focused. Yet in their versatility lies a different kind of danger. A ring that makes one invisible, or grants strength, or protects against poison, seems like a boon, until the wearer realizes they cannot remove it, that it has become part of them, that they would sooner cut off their finger than part with it. There are tales, fragmentary and unverified, of such rings appearing throughout the ages. A merchant in Gondor who wore a ring that allowed him to understand any language, until he began to hear the thoughts of those around him and went mad. A warrior in Rohan who bore a ring that made him undefeatable in battle, until he could not stop fighting, even in peace, and died slaughtering his own comrades. An elven lady who wore a ring that preserved her beauty, until she faded entirely, becoming a ghost of memory, visible only to those who had loved her. Are these merely legends? Cautionary tales meant to warn against the lust for power? Or are they echoes of real events, fragments of history lost to time? The texts do not say, but they hint, they suggest. And in the margins of ancient manuscripts, in notes that Tolkien wrote to himself and never expanded, there are references to rings unaccounted for. Rings given as gifts by Sauron in his fair form, before his treachery was known. Rings crafted by elves who learned the art but used it for their own purposes, not realizing the danger. Rings that drifted through history like flotsam, surfacing in one age only to vanish in the next. Some may have lost their power when the one ring was destroyed. Others may have been so minor that they were unaffected, their enchantments independent of Sauron's masterwork. These would still exist, silent and waiting, in the ruins of cities, in the tombs of forgotten kings, in the hordes of dragons who cared nothing for the history of the treasures they guarded. To find one would be a perilous thing. To wear one, perhaps fatal. Yet the temptation would be overwhelming, for who could resist the promise of power, however small? And once worn, could it be removed? Or would it cling, burrowing into the soul, whispering that just one more day, one more week, one more year would do no harm? The great rings reshaped the world, but the lesser rings reshaped lives, quietly, insidiously, one soul at a time. And in their quiet way, they may have been just as destructive. To understand the rings, we must understand their making, the ritual and the sorcery, the cost and the consequence. The forging of a ring of power was not mere smithcraft. It was an act of will, a metaphysical operation that bound the maker's essence into the metal. Imagine standing before a forge where the flames burn hotter than any natural fire, fed by enchantments older than language. The gold flows like water, the mithril shines like captured starlight. But the crucial ingredient is not metal. It is self. To make a ring of true power, the smith must pour a portion of their own spirit into the work. They must fragment their soul, tearing away pieces of their strength, their will, their very identity, and binding them into the artifact. This is why the rings grant such immense power. They are alive, in a sense, extensions of their maker's being. Sauron understood this better than any. He was Maya, a divine spirit, and his power was immense. When he forged the One Ring in the fires of Mount Doom, he poured so much of himself into it that the ring became, effectively, a second body. While it existed, he was invulnerable. He could be defeated, cast down, even killed, but he would return as long as the ring endured. Yet this was also his weakness, for in binding himself to the ring, he became dependent on it. Its destruction meant his destruction. The other rings were different. They were made by Celebrimbor and the elven smiths of Eregion, with Sauron's guidance but not under his direct control. Each bore the imprint of its maker's intent. The three, Vilya, Narya, and Nenya, were forged last and in secret without Sauron's direct touch, and thus they were free of his dominance, though still vulnerable to the One. The 7 and the 9 were made earlier, with Sauron's full involvement. Into these, he wove bindings, enchantments designed to connect them to the One Ring he had not yet forged but had already conceived. When he finally completed the one and first put it on his finger, speaking the words of command, the bearers of the other rings felt it. A sudden, terrible awareness that they were bound, that their wills were no longer entirely their own. The elves felt this immediately and removed their rings, hiding them and never wearing them while Sauron held the one. The dwarves, as we have seen, resisted. But the men did not understand until it was too late. Yet there is a deeper mystery here. Tolkien suggests that not all the rings were equal in their binding. Some were more tightly connected to the one than others. The 9 were almost extensions of the one itself, which is why the Nazgul could be so completely dominated. The 7 were less tightly bound, which allowed the dwarves their resistance. And the 3 were scarcely bound at all, connected only by the fact that they were made using the same art. What then of the lesser rings? If they were made before the one, before Sauron perfected his binding enchantments, would they be free of its influence? Or did Sauron's later assumption of mastery over the art retroactively extend his control, binding even those rings he had made in earlier, cruder forms? The answer is unclear. But it suggests a tantalizing possibility that there may exist rings whose power is independent, artifacts that respond to no master, that operate by their own logic. These would be the most unpredictable, not as mighty as the great rings, perhaps, but also not bound by the same rules. A ring that has no master cannot be controlled, but neither can it be safely used, for who knows what intentions were woven into its making. The metaphysics of the rings are complex, rooted in Tolkien's theology of Middle-earth. In his cosmology, creation itself is a form of song, a music that shapes reality. To make an artifact of power is to sing a new verse into that music, to alter the fundamental structure of the world. This is why the rings are so dangerous. They are not merely magical items, but wounds in the fabric of being, persistent alterations to the song of creation. When the One Ring was destroyed, the song shifted. The verses that Sauron had sung were erased, or at least fell silent. But what of the verses sung by others? What of the rings made independently, or before Sauron's dominance was complete? Did they fade as well, or do they persist, minor notes in a changed melody, still audible to those with the ears to hear? In the Fourth Age, after the departure of the elves and the fading of the great powers, Middle-earth entered a time of mundane concerns. The age of magic was ending. Yet in the deep places, in the forgotten corners, echoes of the old power remained. And among those echoes, rings may yet sing their silent, seductive songs. The bearers of the rings, elf, dwarf, man, each responded differently, and in those responses we see the nature of corruption laid bare. For men, the rings offered an escape from mortality. This was the deepest temptation, the one they could not resist. Men in Tolkien's mythology are uniquely troubled by death. Elves are immortal, bound to the world until its end. Dwarves, while mortal, are said to return to stone and be remade. But men simply end. Their spirits leave the world and go to a fate unknown even to the Valar. This gift of Iluvatar, as it is called, is also a curse, for it fills men with fear and longing, a desperate hunger for more time. The Nine Rings exploited this hunger. They promised extended life, freedom from disease and aging, and they delivered at first. But the cost was the self. In extending life, the rings hollowed it out, transforming the bearer from a living being into an undead shell. The kings became ringwraiths, immortal but not alive, existing in a state of perpetual hunger and servitude. For dwarves, the corruption took a different form. Dwarves do not fear death as men do. They are stoic, rooted in the endurance of stone. But they love treasure, not with the grasping greed of a dragon, but with the pride of a craftsman in his work. A dwarf sees gold not as mere wealth, but as the frozen light of creation, metal drawn from the bones of the earth and shaped into beauty. The Seven Rings amplified this love into obsession. The dwarf lords who bore them became hoarders, paranoid and isolated, trusting no one, delving ever deeper in search of treasure that could never satisfy. Yet they did not lose themselves entirely. The dwarves' stubbornness, their fundamental nature, resisted the rings' domination. They became corrupted, yes, greedy, suspicious, dangerous, but they remained themselves. This was Sauron's great frustration and perhaps his greatest lesson. Power alone cannot override will. For elves, the temptation was subtler and more poignant. Elves do not fear death, for they do not die. But they grieve. They grieve for the passing of beauty, the fading of the world, the slow entropy that erodes all things. The elves are tied to Arda, the world, and as the ages pass, they feel the weariness of time, the burden of memory. They watch the forests shrink, the stars grow dim, the glory of the elder days fade into the mundane present. The Three Rings offered preservation. Lothlorien, Rivendell, the Grey Havens, these were realms held in stasis by the power of the rings, places where time seemed to stop, where the beauty of the ancient world endured. But this preservation came at a cost. The elves who bore the three could not move forward. They were bound to the past, guardians of fading light, unable to let go. When the One Ring was destroyed and the three lost their power, these realms faded. The elves, released from their self-imposed duty, departed Middle-earth for the undying lands. For them, the end of the rings was bittersweet, a release, but also a surrender, an acknowledgement that the world was no longer theirs. Yet what of those who bore lesser rings or unknown rings? What temptations did they face, and how did they fall? There are hints in the stories. A ring that grants invisibility might seem harmless, even useful. But invisibility is also isolation, a severing from the community of visible beings. To wear such a ring is to step outside the world, to become a voyeur, a ghost. Over time, the wearer might forget what it is to be seen, to be known. They might lose the ability to connect, becoming alienated not just from others, but from their own humanity. A ring that grants strength might seem like pure advantage. But strength without limit is also strength without control. The wearer might find themselves unable to gauge their actions, crushing what they meant to hold gently, destroying what they meant to protect. In time, they might come to see others as fragile, breakable things, unworthy of consideration. A ring that grants foresight might seem like wisdom, but foresight is also burden. To see the future is to know the tragedies that are coming, the losses that cannot be prevented. The wearer might become paralyzed by knowledge, unable to act, or consumed by the futile attempt to change what is fated. Each ring, no matter how minor, carries the potential for corruption because each offers power, and power in Tolkien's philosophy always comes at a cost. The cost is not always obvious. It is not always immediate, but it is always exacted, sooner or later, in ways expected or unexpected. And the worst part, the bearer often does not realize they are being corrupted. The changes are gradual, subtle. By the time they understand what is happening, it is too late. The ring has become part of them, and to remove it would be to remove a piece of their soul. This is the true horror of the rings, not their power, but their insidiousness. They do not conquer by force. They conquer by seduction, by whispering that just a little more, just a little longer, will do no harm. Until one day there is nothing left but the whisper. Now we turn to the deepest mystery. The unknown rings, the ones hinted at but never named, the ones that drift through the margins of history like shadows. In the appendices to The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien writes, "Many elven rings Sauron gathered in that time, and many lesser rings of power that the elves had made in the days of their skill." This sentence opens a door into a vast, unexplored territory. If Sauron gathered many rings, where did they come from? Who made them? What were their powers? And what happened to them? The most tantalizing possibility is that the elves, having learned the art of ring-making from Sauron, or from Celebrimbor, who learned it from Sauron, continued to practice it even after his treachery was revealed. Why would they stop? The art itself was not evil, only Sauron's use of it. An elf smith might reasonably believe that a ring could be made for good purposes, to heal or protect or preserve. But as Gandalf warns, such beliefs are naive. The very act of binding one's power into an external object is dangerous. It creates temptation, dependence, the desire to keep and control. Even a ring made with the best intentions can corrupt simply by existing. There are hints of such rings in the lore. In Unfinished Tales, there is mention of a ring of Barahir, an heirloom of the kings of Númenor. This ring was not one of the rings of power, it predated them, but it was still a ring, and it carried significance passed down through generations. Was it enchanted? We do not know, but the fact that it was treasured suggests it had value beyond mere gold. Other rings appear in fragments and drafts. A ring that allowed communication across great distances. A ring that warded against poison. A ring that granted the wearer the ability to understand the speech of animals. These are mentioned in passing, in notes Tolkien made for his own reference, never fully developed into stories. Why did he leave them unfinished? Perhaps because to detail them too fully would undermine the mythology's sense of depth, its feeling of being ancient and only partially recovered. Or perhaps because he understood that some mysteries are more powerful when left unexplained. But we can speculate. If such rings existed, where would they be now? Some, undoubtedly, were destroyed or lost, cast into the sea, buried in avalanches, consumed by dragonfire. Others may have been deliberately hidden, locked away in vaults by those who understood their danger. The elves, before they departed Middle-earth, might have gathered up such artifacts and taken them to the Undying Lands. removing them from the world of mortals. Yet it is unlikely that all were found. The world is vast, and the ages are long. In the tombs of forgotten kings, in the ruins of cities swallowed by forest, in the hordes of dragons and the treasuries of ancient keeps, rings may yet lie waiting. Tarnished, perhaps covered in dust, their makers long dead and their purposes forgotten. But not powerless, never powerless. What would happen if one were discovered? If a farmer plowing his field unearthed a band of gold, a ring of exquisite craft, and slipped it onto his finger? At first, perhaps nothing. Or perhaps a subtle effect, a sharpening of vision, a lightness in the step, a sense of well-being. The farmer might wear it for years, thinking it merely a lucky trinket. But over time, changes would occur. He might become possessive, unwilling to let anyone touch the ring or even look at it too closely. He might begin to see threats where none exist, to mistrust his neighbors, to hoard his harvests. His family might notice his eyes growing distant, his words turning strange. And if the ring were powerful enough, the transformation might go further. The farmer might fade, becoming something less than human, a creature driven by the ring's original purpose, whatever that might have been. If the ring was meant to protect, he might become paranoid, attacking anyone who came near. If it was meant to command, he might try to dominate his village, enslaving his friends. If it was meant to preserve beauty, he might become obsessed with his appearance, withering away as he stared into mirrors, trying to recapture a youth that never was. The unknown rings are dangerous precisely because they are unknown. We do not know their purposes. We do not know the intentions woven into their making. They are wild artifacts, unbound by any surviving lore, unpredictable in their effects. And yet, despite the danger, they would be irresistible. For who, finding such a ring, would not wonder at its power? Who would not, despite all warnings, slip it on just once, just to see? This is the legacy of the rings of power. Not the great ones alone, but all of them, known and unknown, accounted for and lost. They are temptations scattered through time, waiting for the unwary, the ambitious, the curious. And as long as they exist, the shadow of Sauron lingers, not as a dark lord on a throne, but as a whisper in gold, a promise that can never be kept. The rings did not merely affect individuals. They shaped the course of history, bending the destinies of nations and ages. Consider the kingdoms of men. The 9 rings transformed mortal kings into ringwraiths, but before that transformation was complete, those kings ruled. They commanded armies, made laws, forged alliances. And all the while, the rings influenced their decisions, pushing them toward ambition, toward expansion, toward conflict. How many wars were fought because a ring whispered in a king's ear? How many innocents died because a ruler, driven by enchantment, could not be satisfied? The kingdom of Angmar rose in the north, ruled by the Witch King, and broke the realm of Arnor. This was not mere conquest. It was the working out of the ring's malice, a cancer spreading through the body of Middle-earth. The Witch King might have been a man once, a king with a name and a history. But the ring unmade him, and in unmaking him, it remade the map of the world. The dwarves, too, were shaped by their rings. The wealth they accumulated drew dragons from the north. Smaug the Terrible descended upon Erebor, lured by the hoard that the Ring of Thrain had helped amass. The lonely mountain fell. The dwarves were scattered. And though they eventually reclaimed their home, the intervening years of exile and struggle were, in part, the fruit of the 7 rings' influence. Even the 3, held by the wise and wielded for good, had consequences. The preservation of Lothlorien and Rivendell was beautiful, yes, but it was also a withdrawal. The elves, in holding back the tide of time, isolated themselves from the changing world. They became legends, myths, creatures of rumor glimpsed in deep forests, but no longer part of the daily life of men. When the ring's power faded and the elves departed, they left a gap, a loss of wisdom, of art, of beauty that could not be replaced. And what of the unknown rings, the ones that touched lives without leaving clear records? How many small tragedies unfolded in forgotten villages, where a ring passed from hand to hand, leaving a trail of madness and ruin? How many family lines ended because an ancestor could not let go of a cursed heirloom? How many promising heroes fell into darkness, not because of any great villainy, but because they found a ring in a dungeon and thought it a prize rather than a prison? The ring's influence was fractal, operating at every scale. They shaped the grand sweep of history, yes, but they also shaped individual lives, families, communities. They were the stones thrown into the pond, and the ripples spread outward, touching shores far from the point of impact. Even after Sauron's fall, the consequences lingered. The Fourth Age was an age of men, but it was also an age haunted by the past. The ruins of Minas Morgul stood empty, but no one dared enter them. The paths through Mordor were open, but travelers avoided them, feeling the weight of old malice still hanging in the air. And in the deep places, in the tombs and the vaults and the dragon hoards, artifacts of power waited. Would they ever be found? Would the cycle begin again? The texts do not answer. They end with the departure of the ring-bearers, the sailing of the ship into the west. Frodo, Gandalf, Galadriel, and the others leave Middle-earth, taking with them the last great witnesses to the Age of the Rings. What comes after is silence, or at least a silence in the written record. But we know that history does not end. Kingdoms rise and fall. New generations are born, and they inherit the ruins of the old. And in those ruins, in the forgotten places, treasures lie buried. Treasures that glitter and promise and destroy. The legacy of the Rings of Power is this: that power, once created, cannot be uncreated. It can only be lost or hidden or destroyed with great sacrifice. And even then, echoes remain. Even then, the possibility lingers that somewhere, somehow, the cycle will begin again. For as long as there are rings, there will be those who seek them. And as long as there are those who seek them, the shadow will never entirely fade. In the final accounting, when the songs are sung and the chronicles sealed, what are we to make of the forgotten rings? They are not footnotes. They are not minor details in a saga dominated by greater artifacts. They are instead a reminder of the true nature of power in Tolkien's world, that it is pervasive, insidious, and never entirely gone. The one ring is destroyed, yes. The 3 have faded. The 9 are lost with their wraiths. The 7 are consumed or reclaimed. But the lesser rings, the unknown rings, the rings hinted at in fragments and letters, these remain, in possibility if not in fact. They are the question marks in the margins of history. They are the shadows that move when no one is looking. They are the seductive whisper that says, perhaps this one is harmless, perhaps this one is safe, perhaps this one will give you what you desire without the cost. And perhaps they are right. Perhaps not every ring was a weapon. Perhaps some were made with pure intentions and remained pure. Perhaps some lie in ruins, inert and harmless, waiting for archaeologists rather than adventurers. But we do not know. We cannot know. And in that uncertainty lies the heart of the matter. For Tolkien's mythology is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil. It is a meditation on the nature of power, on the temptations that face every thinking being, on the cost of desire and the fragility of virtue. The rings are symbols of this, beautiful, deadly, irresistible. The Forgotten Rings are the most potent symbol of all, because they represent the unfinished, the unexplored, the dangerous gaps in knowledge. They remind us that not all stories have endings, that not all questions have answers, that the world is deeper and stranger and more perilous than any chronicle can contain. In the Fourth Age, as the elves depart and magic fades from the world, one might imagine that the Age of Rings is over. But is it? Or does it simply go underground, becoming the province of treasure hunters and tomb robbers, of those who seek in darkness what the wise have hidden? The answer, if there is one, lies not in the texts, but in the imagination, in the act of wondering, in the act of asking, what if? What if a ring still exists, buried beneath a fallen tower? What if its bearer is rising even now, driven by enchantments he does not understand? What if the cycle is beginning again, quietly, in some corner of the world where the lore masters do not look? These are not idle questions. They are the questions that keep the mythology alive, that transform it from a closed narrative into an open-ended exploration. They are the questions Tolkien himself might have asked, staring at the fragments of his own creation, wondering what lay in the spaces between the words. And so we come to the end of this telling, but not the end of the tale. The rings are out there, in the world or in the mind, tangible artifacts or symbols of something deeper. They are the gold that glitters in the dark, the promise that can never be fulfilled, the power that corrupts even as it empowers. To speak of them is to invoke them. To remember them is to risk being remembered by them in turn. The Forgotten Rings are not forgotten, not truly. They wait in the deep places, in the margins of lore, in the shadowed corners of imagination. They wait for the hand that will claim them, the voice that will speak their names, the moment when history, having rested, begins its terrible turning once more. And in that waiting, they whisper. They have always been whispering. We have simply not been listening, until now. Dear listener, this story ends, but many await. Subscribe so no tale escapes you.